Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and tonight we're going to learn to play the 1 to 4 player game Imperial Settlers Roll and Write, being released by Portal Games. Imperial Settlers Roll and Write comes with all of the components that you see here, including 48 village sheets, 4 custom dice, 96 empire sheets, 5 favor tokens, 48 village sheets, and 4 pencils. The rulebook recommends starting your first game using the basic rules and playing the multiplayer version of the game. So for our example, we'll remove the adventure sheets for now. The remaining components will be used in our example. To begin setup, give each player a single empire sheet. Then give each player a single village sheet. Next, give each player a pencil. Then shuffle all of the favor tokens and deal out one more favor token than the number of players. In our 4-player example, we'll be using all 5 favor tokens. Place the favor tokens face up in the middle of the play area. Make sure and set the dice nearby as well. After this, choose a start player randomly, and you're ready to play. A game of Imperial Settlers Roll and Write is played over 10 rounds. In each round, players will take actions simultaneously. Each game round will consist of the following 4 phases. The first phase of the game is the roll dice phase. The active player will gather all the dice and then roll them. There are 2 types of dice, resource dice and the worker die. The resource dice will provide players with the resource showing when rolled. Each player uses the same resources from the dice pool. There are 3 different types of resources: wood, stone, and food. There's also gold, which is a wild resource. It can be used in place of any of the other resources. The worker die will determine how many actions each player has during the upcoming round. And once again, it's important to note that the results of these dice affect all players. The next phase of the game is the choose a favor token phase. Beginning with the active player and then continuing around the table in a clockwise order, each player will choose and take a single favor token. These favor tokens will give players a bonus during the round. Once each player has chosen a favor tile, players can move on to the third phase, Expand Your Empire. During the Expand Your Empire phase, all players will take actions at the same time. Players will spend the resources they've gained from the rolled resource dice, as well as any resources players might gain from constructed buildings, or resources that players have harvested from their fields. The number of actions that a player can take in the round is determined by the worker die, and any bonus actions they may receive from favor tiles or buildings that they've constructed. For each action that a player has in a round, they can check one of the boxes on either their village sheet or their empire sheet. Players can take 2 types of actions on their turn. They can either check boxes to take the build action, or they can cross off circles in their fields to take the harvest action. Let's look at taking the build action first. With a build action, a player can check off any of the boxes on their village sheet, or any of the construction boxes on their empire sheet. Checking each box would cost 1 action, and some boxes have resource requirements printed in them as well. In the basic game, players can ignore the architect's building. It will only be used when playing with the advanced rules, which we'll go over at the end of this video. If a box shows a wood, a stone, or a food symbol, a player must pay this cost from their resource pool in addition to using one of their actions on their turn. So let's look at this player's turn, for example. They have 4 available actions, plus a 5th action that was given to them with this favor tile. They also have 1 wood, 1 gold, and 1 food available to them. For 1 action, this player could check off this box on their farm. This would cost them 1 of their available actions and the 1 wood that they have in their resource pool. So for the rest of this round, this player can only cross off 4 boxes, and the only resources they have available to them are 1 gold and 1 food. It's also important to note that some action boxes have no resource requirements. So this player could cross off the remaining 2 boxes with 2 of their remaining 4 actions. They would now have 2 actions left on their turn. Once a building has all of its boxes checked, that building is considered to be constructed. This will grant the player a special ability that they can use once per round. It's important to note that a player can't use a building's special ability in the same round that it's built. It has to be used starting on the next round. Some buildings have a star next to their title. Buildings with stars next to their name only provide players with abilities that are triggered during final scoring. These bonuses won't trigger during gameplay. Each other building will provide players with a various bonus that may give them extra resources or different abilities when they harvest or depending on how the dice are rolled. For instance, the farm will give players an extra food that they can use each round, while the collector would give players 1 gold, assuming all resource dice rolled show a different result. It's important to remember that this bonus will apply once per round. The fortress has multiple spaces that can be crossed off along the bottom of the building. It's important to note that spaces next to a building can be crossed off in any order. So for instance, a player could start by crossing off all of the stone and then finish by crossing off all of the wood at a later time. The fortress will give players an in-game bonus of 3 points for each section they are able to cross off. So for instance, if the player were able to cross off this wood and this stone, they would score 3 points. If they could do it again in the second column, they would score 3 additional points. And they would score 3 additional here if they crossed off these boxes as well. With the actions on their turn, players can also choose to cross off boxes within the 4 construction rows. The construction rows can be found along the top half of the Empire sheet and will give players points at the end of the game, as well as the ability to harvest fields. Players can cross off boxes within the construction rows in the same way that they cross off boxes next to their buildings on the village sheet. Some boxes may contain resource costs, and some sections of the construction rows may have more than 1 box to cross off to complete them. For instance, by paying 2 wood from their resource pool and spending 1 action, a player could cross off this box. This section would now be completed and the player would score 2 points at the end of the game for doing this. However, this section has 3 separate boxes that must be checked before the player can earn the 1 victory point bonus. It's important to note that players must fill in the furthest left available space of each row on the construction line. So for instance, this player would have to start with this box and then move to this box, and so forth for this construction row. At the end of the game, players will score victory points based on how far they've completed each row. So for instance, if this player were able to cross off every box, including this box at the end of the game, they would score 11 victory points for this row. And it's important to note that players can cross off boxes within each row and will score points for each row as well. It's also important to note that the last section of each row is called the Imperial section and will provide the most victory points. Some game effects may refer to these sections. The bottom row of the construction section is known as the Bridges row. As players fill in boxes of the Bridges row, they will score points, but they'll also unlock fields that they can then harvest. Let's say, for instance, that this player has crossed off these 2 boxes. Crossing off these 2 boxes would unlock this bridge symbol. When this happens, a player will immediately circle the bridge that they've unlocked. Doing this will give the player access to this field. When a player has crossed off the boxes within the next section, they would be able to circle the bridge that relates to this symbol as well. Now, in addition to having access to the first field, by circling the second bridge, the player is then given access to the second field as well. Once players have unlocked a field, they can harvest resources from those fields. During the round, by using one of their actions, a player can cross off any one resource in any of their available fields to gain that resource to be used immediately. So for one action, this player could cross off this wood symbol in one of their available fields. They would now have 1 wood that they could use to take more actions during the round. It's important to note that as soon as players unlock these fields, they can then harvest from them immediately, even within the same round. Once all of the players have used their workers and they're ready to continue, they'll mark the current round complete on their Empire sheet. All of the favor tiles will be returned to the middle, and then the next player in clockwise order becomes the active player. A new round can then begin. Players will continue to play in this way until they've completed 10 rounds. After the end of the 10th round, the players will move to final scoring and sum up their victory points. During endgame scoring, players will add together all of the points from each row of the construction section, as well as any points gained from their fortress buildings or from the export favor tile. After totaling all of these points, the player with the most victory points is the winner. It's important to note that this section is only used for the advanced rules, which we'll discuss in a moment. If there's a tie, the player with the most completed bridge sections will win, If there's still a tie, the player with more harvested spaces on their field wins, and if there's still a tie, the tied players will share the victory. Now that we've learned the basic rules of the game, let's look at what each favor tile does in detail. If the player selects the export tile during the round, they can trade up to 3 different resources for 1 point each. With the ally tile, the player will gain an extra action during the round. The boon allows players to choose one rolled result and gain an extra resource that matches that result. The lucky coin will give players 1 extra gold during the round. With the yield favor tile, players are allowed to choose one of the rolled resources. They can then harvest as many resources that match the rolled result from their unlocked fields as they want, and they don't have to use actions for this. Now that we've covered the basic game, let's look at the rules to play the advanced game. The advanced game will use the same rules as the basic game, with the main difference being that the architect building will come into play. It's also important to note that many buildings have these blueprint shapes printed next to them. These are used in the advanced rules as well. In the advanced rules, there's one additional phase added to the game before the round end phase, and it's called the creating a settlement phase. During this extra phase, each player may create one single settlement in their empire. To create a settlement, a player would first choose one of the shapes listed next to one of their buildings. They would then choose to draw the selected shape along the outlines of some of their completed sections in their construction rows. For instance, since these 3 sections have been completed, this player could choose this section of their construction rows to create a settlement. In this example, the player has chosen to create a settlement that will boost their farm. It's important to note that the shape of the settlement and how it's drawn has to match exactly. When you create a settlement, a player is allowed to cross off the value showing on that settlement and increase it by 1. So by creating this settlement, the player has increased the power of their farm. Now, instead of receiving 1 food per round, they'll receive 2 from this building's ability. Some buildings, such as the architects, will give players a set amount of points for each settlement they create that matches their shape. It's also important to note that more than one settlement for the same building can be created. So for instance, let's say in a future round, a player decided to boost their farm once again. The player would simply cross out the old value and increase it by 1 again. It's also important to note that players can complete settlements for buildings that aren't yet completed. They would still cross out the value and write a new value, but they wouldn't be able to get this bonus until they've built the building. It's also important to note that settlements must be completely unique. They can't be part of any other settlement. When playing with the advanced rules, players will list any points that they've gained by completing settlements in this box here. These will be added to the normal points that players score during the basic game. It's also important to note that Imperial Settlers Roll and Write includes an adventure mode designed to be played by a single player. The adventure mode uses the advanced game rules. The only changes to setup are that players will take one of the 48 village sheets designed for the adventure mode, shuffle and draw 3 random favor tokens, and each round, the player will be able to choose one of the 3 favor tokens to use. It's also important to note that some buildings in the adventure mode allow players to re-roll dice. At the beginning of the player's Expand the Empire phase, they have to decide if they want to use any re-roll abilities before they do anything else. Once a player does anything else, they can't re-roll dice anymore. Alright everybody, thanks so much for watching. That was our video. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email us directly at thedicey@gmail.com. If you want to hear more from the Dicey Review, you can listen to the Dicey Review podcast. It can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, pretty much any podcasting app. You can read our written reviews at thediceyreview.com and make sure and connect with us at our Board Game Geek Guild or on social media. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you at the table.